We have a number 4, please.
Concerning the analysis of census tracts of Galveston County, Texas, identification of high opportunity neighborhoods for locating scattered site public housing.
Dr. McClure?
Mayor, members of the City Council, it's a great pleasure to get to come to Galveston. I have not been here since I was a small boy, and you can look at me and tell that was quite some time ago. So it is fun to be back. We don't have palm trees in the Kansas City area, so this is good. I like this. It has been a great pleasure to do this project for you. I am particularly involved in a great deal of affordable housing research. I do a good deal of work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and certainly sympathize with the very hard task they face, but I have even greater sympathy for what's happening to cities across America today. All cities that receive any federal community development or housing monies are being asked to rework their analysis of impediments. The problem is HUD is in the process of redefining how it will go about assessing whether a city is affirmatively furthering fair housing. Galveston has been placed in a very tough situation. Hurricane Ike is forcing your hand. You're having to move ahead without knowing how this work is going to be evaluated, which puts you, whether you wanted to or not, you are going to be at the cutting edge of this new effort to affirmatively further fair housing. Specifically, you gave me multiple tasks. I'm going to try to summarize them just very quickly, collapse them down into 3 tasks. First, the identification of high opportunity neighborhoods, and I'll define that for you in just a minute. Secondly, to review and analyze plans for regionalization of opportunities in low-income housing. There has been a great deal of work already done. The nice thing about the situation you're in is you can learn from what has gone before. And then the third one is to analyze the viability of maintaining income diversity. Simply put, you have proposed mixed income developments in Galveston City, and we have, again, a good deal of mixed income research on mixed income housing that will help us. Let me first just give you a sense of what census tracts are. They are a somewhat unusual entity created by the Bureau of the Census. We tend to use them synonymously with neighborhoods. That probably isn't the best thing. Census tracts are a little bit larger. In the Galveston County area, we're looking at a population of about 4,700 people and about 2,100 housing units. And I think if you ask most people about what is their perception of a neighborhood, it's usually much smaller than that. The way census data are gathered, when we move to smaller definitions, the numbers really just aren't reliable. So most of us work with census tracts, and so that's why I've done the analysis at that level. What I've shown you in this first map is the 61 census tracts of Galveston County. I don't want to get too detailed, but just so you're not confused from other information you see, Galveston County now has a different count of housing tracts. What happens with each decennial census is census tracts that expand get cut into 2, 3, however many, to keep them down to roughly 4,500 people. If a tract is losing population, adjacent tracts will be collapsed into a single one, and both of those factors have happened on the mainland in Galveston County. The problem is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development hasn't quite caught up with the Census Bureau. So the HUD data that are all important to making decisions on this are still tied to the 2000 delineation. So you're going to find my work is done on that basis. I also not only took data from the Census Bureau and HUD, but also made use of data from the FBI to give us information on crime. Another little footnote, just so we understand, this is less than ideal. The FBI data are collected at city level. City boundaries and tract boundaries don't always overlap precisely. So the way this is done is we look at crime levels in tracts based upon the community in which the majority of the tract is located. Now, for most tracts, that's one and the same. But what it does mean is we are losing some of the variation. For example, East Galveston versus West Galveston. There are variations across the city, but we can't capture that within the data we have. So with that, we're looking at a variety of things. Let me just describe how this process of identifying high opportunity neighborhoods has been undertaken. Congress is constantly looking for greater effectiveness in the expenditure of our taxpayers' dollars. Just in round numbers, we spend about $44 billion a year on affordable housing in the United States. That's a big chunk of change. Congress is not satisfied with just finding cost-effective, affordable housing in that. Congress is mandating HUD, and therefore HUD is getting on all of us to do a better job to not only use those dollars to find affordable shelter, but to help break the cycle of poverty. We no longer want to see our assisted housing exacerbate the problems of concentrated poverty. We want them to, in fact, break down the cycle of poverty, to help move people into neighborhoods where they can find gainful employment, where they can gain access to good schools, where they can receive better health care, where they can live in areas with less concern, in fact, hopefully be free of fear of crime, and promote, most importantly, both economic and racial integration. Economic integration is a buzz phrase for meaning breaking up concentrations of poverty and promoting living in income-diverse neighborhoods. And certainly racial diversity pretty well speaks for itself. It means breaking up concentrations of minorities and helping all neighborhoods provide affordable housing for all interested households. So with that, I have been part of HUD's effort to do this work. I've put together for Galveston an index that looks at the 61 census tracts against 8 criteria. While I was doing this work for you, it was very interesting. HUD then released its own proposed rule for the affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I got pretty darn close. So the 8 criteria that I have are pretty close to what HUD's going to be using. First and foremost is that they are looking for poverty to be lower, and in the criteria I've used here is poverty below 10%. It has been a standard criteria that has existed in all of HUD's effort. In fact, ironically, in all of HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing, it's the only criteria that has been there in every effort. Surprisingly, race mixing fell out of its efforts to affirmatively further fair housing for a while. It's come back in. A second issue that comes up with poverty is one of what we call thresholds. The best research tells us roughly this, that if a neighborhood is somewhere between 0 and 10% poverty, adding additional poverty to that neighborhood has no effect on the level of distress in the neighborhood as long as we keep it below that 10% threshold. Once we reach a number we're not sure, somewhere between 10 and 15, each additional poverty increases the level of distress in the neighborhood, measured by loss of property values, lower levels of reinvestment in homes, a variety of different indicators. As a minor point of interest, there seems to be another threshold somewhere between 30 and 40%. Once a neighborhood has reached that level of poverty, no further harm seems to happen. The concentrated poverty seems to have done its harm by that point. So you can imagine, given that, and given the especially high incidence of assisted housing in those upper poverty level tracts, we're trying very hard to reverse that, to bring it down so that we can disperse the poverty. What that means for our purposes is point number 2. We want to make sure that the tracts we identify as high opportunity tracts are not ones that are increasing in poverty. We don't want any action taken by a community to move a tract from low poverty into higher levels of poverty. The third one is a particular challenge that you have here in the Galveston area. This is true for an awful lot of urban Texas, but certainly the Houston metropolitan area and Galveston are no exception. We have a very interesting mix of non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic African Americans here in this area. By standard measures of minority concentration, you are 45%. Understand that nationally the number is 34%. So that in terms of achieving levels of racial integration, it's going to be a little more challenging here in the Galveston area. The others will just go through quickly because I think they pretty much speak for themselves. We want recipients of housing assistance to locate where there are higher performing schools. We are having a great deal of difficulty using the data from the Leave No Child Left Behind data, so I have adopted the standard one of just looking at the rate of high school dropouts, and the usual measure is the national average, that if we find high school dropouts below 14%, it's deemed to be a high opportunity area. We want people to have access to employment. HUD is working hard to get data on the location of jobs. Those data really aren't ready to use yet, so in the absence of that, we look at the level of unemployment. We want it to be lower than 8%. We also want access to jobs. Again, Galveston follows the national trend. The areas where we find lower poverty, lower unemployment, tend to be the areas with lower transportation access. The normal measurement we use for that is short commute times. We'd like to see something on the order of 70% of the workforce, adults 25 years and older, able-bodied in the workforce, having commute times of less than 30 minutes. We'd like to have 70% of the workforce in that. The crime one is slightly interesting. There is no standard measure of that. In fact, the national expert lives just a couple of miles up the road here. A colleague of mine, we're having some difficulty there. I've adopted one of Ned Levine's standards. We take violent crime, give it extra weight, add property crime, and then look for fewer than 700 incidents per year per 100,000 population. Nothing magical about that number, but it seems to be a normally accepted number. That below that means it's a relatively modest level of crime. Above that is deemed to be higher. What's interesting about that, HUD has dropped that from its proposed rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So where that one's going to go, I don't know. The last one is one that has been debated fiercely in Washington, so there is probably less agreement on this one than any other, but it has to do with the presence of other assisted housing. Do we want to create pockets of assisted housing? The rule that's probably most popular among academics is the notion that we should not have assisted households, meaning households with a voucher, or housing units, public housing, Section 8 housing, tax, go through the list. Those should not add up to more than 4% of the housing stock. I assure you there is just no agreement on this particular one. So it's going to be interesting to see how it works. What we come up with when we look is fairly straightforward. None of the 61 tracts in Galveston County meet all 8 criteria. All right? So then that means we have to relax the criteria at some level. I picked a number somewhat arbitrarily and said, what if we look at the tracts that meet 6 or 7 of these criteria? 15 tracts that do that. 12 are on the mainland, 3 are on the island. They are not distributed spatially uniformly. The ones on the island are, as you can see, are in the western part of the developed area of Galveston. Those on the mainland are clearly biased toward the north. Tracts 1 through 6 in the northwest corner have about half of these tracts, certainly the northern part, and then there's a few in the perimeter of Texas City. You also asked me to rank order all the tracts, and I think that's a useful exercise because obviously I was making a judgment call on setting some of these criteria, and then the notion of a threshold of 6. The advantage of having them laid out this way is we can put them across a continuum to see the areas that perform least well and the areas that perform best. You can see that the eastern side of Galveston Island performs least well according to these criteria. Many of the tracts meet either none or only one or two of the criteria. Similarly, within on the mainland, Lamarck area has some difficulties, but again, the northern part of the county performs very well. So that's where I would say, if were I to prepare a regional housing plan in the Galveston area, I would start with that and then move further along. So let me move, and I'll try to move fairly quickly on these other two so as not to give you an enormous amount of detail, because never give a professor an unlimited amount of time to talk. It's always a bad idea, you know. And the other problem, of course, is probably my most favorite topic on earth. I get a great deal of joy in studying this material, but looking at plans for regional housing is something I've been doing for a very long time, and I had, full disclosure, I'm an employee of HUD in my off hours and had an appointment to HUD not long ago, so, but I always had the independence of an academic appointment, which meant I was free to disagree with HUD, but I think you'll find that HUD as an organization is actually a pretty open-minded organization. They are perfectly happy to have dissension within the ranks, as it were. For all that there are disagreements, there is a national trend in place, and the trend is, simply put, to remove public housing from the portfolio of assisted housing. Both my brothers were professors. One of them was a history professor, and he always hates it when I give these 30-second histories because he was a history professor. But public housing was created in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we had an enormous shortage of housing. We also had a depression where we needed the stimulus effect of the construction of housing. So in many ways, and remember in the 1930s, Keynesian economics wasn't really accepted. We didn't know that, in fact, government spending would actually stimulate the economy. So in many ways, public housing was a first foray into that. Public housing served the country well for a long period of time. By the 1970s, we ceased to be a nation with too little housing. In fact, from then on, we've been a nation with a good deal of, numerically, we have enough housing. The issue now is affordability. As a consequence, it's an oversimplification, but in many ways, public housing has run its course. The portfolio of public housing is now getting smaller and smaller. Several major communities, Atlanta being at the forefront of this, is getting rid of all of its public housing. We are now down to about 1.2 million units of public housing. We were just under 2 in the 1970s. So understand the trend is to get rid of it. I'm not predicting that all of it will go away. We have a good deal of elderly and special needs housing. We have housing for the disabled, housing for people with AIDS. We have a variety of special needs projects that are performing very well. But I think the quick answer on public housing for families is that it concentrates poverty. That does not do any good for the families that are themselves poor in those concentrations. It makes the projects very hard to manage, and now we've discovered that the developments themselves have negative impacts on the surrounding neighborhoods. So, slowly but surely, we're phasing it out. The policies we have adopted nationally are to disperse poor residents of public housing into high opportunity neighborhoods. That definition has changed over time. The reason we've adopted that is because we have found that, done correctly, the households that are relocated can realize gains in access to employment, gains in the quality of the education for their children, and in fact, very measurable health gains from moving away from high crime, high poverty concentrated areas into relatively low crime, mixed income areas. The process of creating success is more than simply relocating people. They need supportive services. That means housing, counseling, and then ongoing assistance in order to maintain a position in these high opportunity neighborhoods. As you can imagine, a lot of communities that do not previously have assisted housing and have very low levels of poverty are not always enthusiastic about receiving this. It takes a good deal of effort and convincing. Bluntly, it takes very skillful implementation by the housing authorities who are charged with this work to overcome that, to make sure that the receiving communities understand that the assisted housing will either be their own existing housing now that exists, or if it's replacement housing, it will be well-designed and well-managed such that it becomes an asset in the neighborhood rather than a liability. The other important point is that the housing should not create new concentrations of poverty. That's part of the difficulty I highlighted a minute ago with use of tracts. Tracts are too big. A lot of neighborhoods can exist within a tract. It's very easy for a large development to move into a small area of a census tract and create problems for that area. It may not be felt by the bulk of the tract, but it certainly is felt by the neighborhood immediately around it. So it's crucial that as we move into this new era of assisted housing, that we do it with sufficient care. Let me highlight that there is a legal problem in this. Congress set rules on how we can employ vouchers and how we can disperse tax credits. It is not entirely clear that we can legally say to a housing authority, you cannot put units into a neighborhood such that you push the number of assisted units above 4%. Some readings of the law, it's not decided yet, but some readings say that that would be illegal to so instruct a housing authority, which is why then you're seeing so much difficulty that HUD is having with new affirmatively furthering fair housing. So, you have a tough task there. The last question you asked of me had to do with the viability of mixed income public housing. We have had a variety of efforts along this line in a variety of cities. The program once called Hope 6, it's now been renamed Choice Neighborhoods, but effectively the same program. It was a competitive program. Housing authorities said, gee, we're going to take a proposal to HUD. We're going to come up with a plan locally defined which tears down the distressed public housing, replaces it with mixed ownership, mixed income housing, so that we're reducing the density of the housing, we're reducing the concentration of poverty, and we're providing for truly mixed income. What we've learned from that experience is a couple of things. First, there must be a critical mass of market rate units. I will have to tell you candidly that no researcher is willing to stick their neck out and tell you what that number is. So I've gone through all the literature, and I'm going to stick my neck out, because what the heck, you need some information. The number seems to center around 20%. That's important for you because the developments that are proposed here in Galveston are 51% low income. So therein lies some of your difficulty. The second issue is that to be successful, they need to be located in low poverty tracts. At its most simple level, the upper income households that you are attempting to attract to the mixed income developments, these are people who have choice by virtue of their income. For them to be attracted to these mixed income developments mean they must be happy with the quality of the development, the quality of its management, the quality of the people with whom they share that development, and importantly, the quality of the neighborhood surrounding it. There have been a very few exceptions where mixed income housing has survived. But let me just be clear, these are in places like Washington, D.C., Boston, Massachusetts, San Francisco. These are such tight housing markets that people chase ambulances to find a vacant unit. I wish I could say that's true about Galveston. It is not. I remember I'm a native of Kansas City, so it's not true in Kansas City, and I do a lot of work in St. Louis as well, so it's not true in those cities that I tend to work with. The Washingtons and the Bostons and San Franciscos are the rare exceptions, and sadly, Galveston is not one of the exceptions. So clearly, neither of the criteria are met with the proposed developments. Certainly, the two tracts are not the same. One is very heavily minority concentrated and has a high incidence of assisted housing. The other is less heavily concentrated, but still would not meet what I would deem to be the threshold for making viable mixed-income housing. You asked also about the impact of the proposed developments on the receiving neighborhoods, and I think the answer is fairly straightforward. The developments will further concentrate poor and minorities in neighborhoods that already have high concentrations of poor and minorities, which runs counter to the notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing. You asked me about the viability of it. I'll preface this by saying in a former life, I was an underwriter. I used to do lending for multifamily mixed-income housing projects in Massachusetts. I spent an awful lot of time studying markets, knowing what it takes to keep the occupancy level high enough that a project can make good on its debt service and still maintain high levels of investment. I have to tell you that I think the market conditions surrounding the two mixed income developments you have here are not good candidates for project viability. They may enjoy a little bit of a honeymoon in their early going because they will be brand new projects, you know, and you got brand new bathrooms, brand new appliances, brand new parking lots, everything's great. But after a few years, the likelihood that it will maintain sufficiently high occupancy to be viable, those chances are very poor. What will happen then is they will have to market the market rate units to increasingly poorer households. So that's my report, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
Mr. Papoose?
Thank you, Dr. McClure. I have a few questions.
Sure.
The first one, you spoke about Atlanta's mixed income, and they're moving away from public housing and straight into mixed income, and I believe that the old GHA board, traveled to Atlanta to see what they were doing. You also said that 20% is the threshold for the delineation between market rate units and assisted units. Do you know what Atlanta's number was?
It varies from project to project. Some of them are, in fact, much higher. As you can imagine, the Olympic Village area, the area around Georgia Tech, they are doing quite well. Now, remember, none of these have a lengthy history. So an underwriter like me says, call me in a few years. I want to see how it performs, in the fifth year. In fact, in underwriting, what you worry about is the seventh or eighth year. That's when problems with the entry doors show up. Appliances need to be replaced. We don't have that history yet. One other advantage that Atlanta has, it is a majority-minority community. So racial integration is not a goal in Atlanta. They're making no efforts to do that. So I think they're going to have some difficulties in future when they are assessed on their performance that way. But I believe several of their projects will probably perform pretty well, the downtown ones especially.
Okay. Next, in your report, you talked about Gautreaux, which is the lawsuit between an individual up in Chicago and HUD. And who was involved in that lawsuit?
Actually, Mrs. Gautreaux was just the first of a very long list of people, but it's known as Gautreaux because she happened to be the first woman who signed up. The lawsuit was filed by the NAACP. It was filed against the Chicago Housing Authority and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the charge was discrimination.
Okay. And that's a civil rights violation, isn't it?
It was, yes.
And are you familiar with Thompson v. Baltimore?
Yes, in Baltimore.
And could you answer my questions for that? Who was the plaintiff, who was the defendant, and...
I believe it was the NAACP, but I'm not sure exactly who was the plaintiff, but again, it was HUD. Mm-hmm. What was different about Baltimore is that the defendants were beyond just the central city.
Right.
So,
which leads me to my next question about Thompson. You spoke about, in Gautreaux, census tracts have been used to identify areas of high opportunity to implement the fix the judge wants to the housing program there. Did Thompson employ the same criteria?
It employed pretty much the same criteria. The disappointing difference with Baltimore was the lack of counseling. When a household receives a housing choice voucher, they get a minimal amount of guidance on what are the rules of the program. They're told you must find a unit in a certain amount of time, it must pass inspection, its rents must be below a certain ceiling. That amount of guidance was given to all the recipients in the Baltimore area. In Chicago, they went much, much further. The Gautreaux recipients, the people who volunteered for the vouchers with the restriction they must move out, they were given assistance in finding a unit. They were then given case managers to help them get their kids in school, find a laundromat, find grocery stores, all the kind of support services that I think is the reason that Gautreaux found so much greater success than they did in Baltimore.
Okay. This next question, I know people don't like to answer yes or no, but you have participated in trials concerning fair housing and the duty to affirmatively further fair housing.
I have.
How many?
Actually, only two where I went and testified. I have given depositions in others.
Okay. And were you considered an expert witness?
I was.
And so I'm going to ask you this, and I'd like you to treat, I know this is a tough one, but I'd like you to treat it as if the judge is directing you to a yes or no answer. The GHA plans for Cedar Terrace affirmatively further fair housing, yes or no?
I would say it does not. The answer is no.
The GHA plans for Magnolia affirmatively further fair housing, yes or no?
I would say no.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes,
Okay.
okay. Then we are in rotate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're on the 10-minute clock. I just want you to know before you start. Ms. Nelly's keeping, so you are next.
Well, do you want to go down that way? I can
No,
wait.
no, go ahead.
Okay,
As-
all right.
As you come.
I just have a question. So let's just say all the stuff that you're stating, and these places are built, and there's a lawsuit, then they would be suing HUD, not the city, correct?
That's a legal question that I think
Well,
need
how
to
about in
direct.
your best interest? I mean, in what you've learned so far, because it's actually HUD that's wanting the housing built, so what have you seen from the lawsuits that you've just mentioned?
The lawsuits that I have seen are charges of discrimination,
Right.
not a failure to affirmatively further fair housing. It is not clear to me, and I'd have to seek legal counsel to know who would be the parties in a suit about a failure to affirmatively further fair housing.
Okay, because the way that I see it, if it is, as you state, and these housings are built, I mean, all of this has been approved by HUD and GLO and everything like that, so, and the city is accommodating because we've taken so much FEMA money, and our budget that we're getting ready to approve is based on that FEMA money that we've accepted, and based on that we would build these housing developments. So you don't have any documentation to say that the city would be liable if we did something in error?
Ma'am, I do sympathize enormously with the position you're in. I'm a policy wonk. My job is to look at the neighborhood conditions, and I'm an underwriter to look at the viability of projects, but issues of legal liability better left to the lawyers.
All right, well, see, my understanding of all of this would be HUD, not the City of Galveston, so that's all I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Ms. Roth? Yes, please.
Welcome, Dr. McClure.
Thank you.
I'm Elizabeth Beaton. And I guess one of the questions I have is how you get public housing or project-based vouchers into high-opportunity areas. If there's not a public housing authority with jurisdiction over that area.
You're going to find that jurisdictional boundaries are becoming less and less important, especially on the voucher side. In fact, HUD is taking very conscious steps to help housing authorities make them, as they say, portable, so that the households will look beyond the jurisdictional boundaries. The project-based vouchers are a little more difficult, but again, HUD is pushing all of us to search for regional solutions. Where you have a housing authority operating in a jurisdiction, then it's a relatively easy process. One can initiate, the other can receive. The difficulty, as you can imagine, is when you have a target, high-opportunity neighborhood that does not have a local PHA serving it. What has happened in most of those situations is they have developed metropolitan-wide housing authorities, and they have taken over the action. Other approaches In fact, probably more common is that a nonprofit sponsor takes over many of the development duties and operates under contract for a housing authority or a metropolitan housing authority, simply operates the same way a for-profit developer would do. So there are mechanisms to do this, can be done.
Outside the jurisdiction of an established public housing authority, you can hire a private contractor
Oh,
to
yes.
operate in another city?
Yes.
Do you have to have the permission of the city to place the housing there?
That's a question I can't answer. I have been involved in multiple of these projects. There is nothing that I have ever seen about project-based housing that allows the housing authority to override local zoning and planning issues. So it must go through the normal process. You may recall in the report I spoke to the issue of the Twin Cities, the case up there. For years, it took a lot of time to convince the receiving communities that these, in fact, would be a fair share of the housing burden that they should receive. Many of the receiving communities threw up roadblocks by way of their planning exercise. So it takes skill.
Well, I'm not even thinking about planning and zoning. I just assume that well, what about public housing as opposed to project-based vouchers? Do you know whether you can put those, like whether the Galveston Housing Authority could put those in League City, for example?
Ma'am, I can think of so few examples of that. I don't know that we could draw a generalization. Remember that you are in an especially unusual world right now that you are being asked to rebuild public housing. Nationwide, we're trying to unwind the public housing portfolio. So, I'm afraid I just don't have any personal experience, and I'm trying to scratch the back of my head for published work on that particular topic.
Are you familiar with Sandpiper Cove?
No,
It's
I'm
a
sorry.
project-based, it's a development here, it's project-based vouchers, 192 project-based vouchers that are awarded annually by HUD in Houston. And very much a concentration of poverty. But HUD continues to renew the contract year after year.
I'll say that.
Privately owned, though.
Oh, yeah.
It's privately owned.
You know, we fall into the habit of thinking about vouchers and public housing.
Yes.
But in fact, there is a larger piece of the portfolio, the old Section 8 new construction substantial rehab program. There are more of those units than there are public housing, and it tends to be a forgotten part of the portfolio. It costs us $9 billion a year, and they are getting old. And as an underwriter, I get real nervous about properties when they start getting 20 and 30 years old. Roofs begin to go, windows start to leak. They're a problem.
So would it make sense, I mean, Galveston is part of the Houston-Galveston Area Council. There's 13 counties in that region. There are numerous public housing authorities in that region. Would it make sense to look at that larger area, to look for high-opportunity tracts for public housing?
Certainly, it makes sense to make these regional. The need for a regional plan was especially important in the Baltimore case. Unfortunately, the judge made no effort to define the concept of a region. HUD's proposed rule on its new tool for assessing affirmatively furthering fair housing is very vague on the topic. That was my particular concern when I read it and posted my comments back to HUD. HUD is walking a very thin line. It knows it's going to get beat up in Congress when this rule gets investigated very closely. There's a large body of research that speaks to the need to do this kind of work at a metropolitan level. How we define that is very hard. Is Galveston a separate metropolitan area from Greater Houston? I'm sure we could make that argument either way.
And much of your concern is based on the fact that Galveston is essentially a soft market with more than enough housing units already to house our population. They may not be in the right price ranges, but there are enough units.
Yeah.
And so your concern about Magnolia Homes and Cedar Terrace is that there's not the demand that would make those units successful compared to cities like San Francisco and Washington, D.C., where demand is so high.
Yep.
So over time, if I understood you correctly, the pressure will be on the developer to begin to lower the rents for the market rate units. And that eventually they'll probably want to start accepting Section 8 vouchers for those units. Is that the case?
I do not know the development agreement between the city and the developer, so whether there's a willingness or an ability to accept vouchers, I'm afraid I can't comment.
But you just are fearful that the rents will start to decline so that there's really no distinction between the public housing units and the other units?
I think they will have to be accepting increasingly lower income households to keep the projects viable. Rent concessions as a lender, that's what you really don't want to see. You've got a lot of money in that project, and if they can't make debt service payments, it becomes non-viable.
Did you read the paper today,
No, ma'am?
their comments?
Well, the Kansas City Star, but I'm afraid I...
One of them is that one of the high-opportunity tracts identified in your report, quote, is a cow pasture off of State Highway 6. It's a high-opportunity tract with no jobs, no transportation, no services, no food stores, and no people, just cows. Is that true?
That may well be true. Remember, my analysis is an unbiased observer looking at the market data from the FBI, from the Census Bureau, and from HUD. So I can tell you what those census tract numbers say. That does not mean that every place in each tract offers that same high level of opportunity. At the level of selecting sites, the next step is you need to find somebody who really knows the real estate market like the back of their hand, because as you can imagine, some sites are going to have good access to transportation, others are not.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. McClure, the contradictions that are here, and the platform that I ran on and others, that portable vouchers were absolutely the way to go, and thinking that this was something that HUD actually was going to endorse, the reality is not that. From Secretary Donovan, I was closer to him than I am to you, told me that you will go back to Galveston, and you will build back the developments at Cedar and Magnolia. If you don't, we're going to come down there and do it without you. It was real clear. The other thing that concerns me and everybody here is that, in fact, the mixed income will not go the way you suggested it might go. And I think the only way that can happen is if this council or the councils after us allow that to go the way it is in the deed restrictions. So we're guarding against that from happening. Now, you can't ever say it's not going to happen, I know that. There are contradictions in what you're saying and what the federal government is saying. And the city, of course, his hands are tied because of all of our disaster recovery funds are tied for us to go forward with the Cedar and Magnolia. Then we're faced with, if we go into a situation where we don't do what we have already, this council has already voted to do, we could be looking at years or decades in litigation. So I don't know, if based on everything that you said, and not to say that you're not an expert or anything, I don't know that if what you said is true when you come to what HUD is going to actually demand of us. So there are contradictions in your report.
Certainly, it disagrees with what you have been told. I assure you, I am not an expert at predicting what the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is going to do. I've been watching HUD for most of my adult life, and there are times when I'm absolutely amazed. Secretary Donovan, though, is a person who's in an unenviable position. He must carry out whatever Congress mandates. If they mandate in the use of FEMA money a certain type of approach, his hands are tied. So, yes, there's an obvious disconnect between the instructions being given to you and the policies that I see normally being applied by HUD. My job was simply to answer the questions about whether or not this proposal helps locate affordable housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods, and the answer is no, that it does not.
And I am not arguing with your findings.
I understand, Mayor.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything? No. Mr. Peppers.
3 last questions. Just to reiterate, your answer to, does the Galveston Housing Authority's plan for Cedar Terrace affirmatively further fair housing is?
No.
No. Is the Galveston Housing Authority's plan for Magnolia affirmatively further fair housing?
It does not.
And you have identified the opportunities that, high opportunities would be located on the west end of this island?
I'm not entirely sure how locally you define that. That's why I've tried to spell out very specific tracts. As I look at the map, the far west end is really a resort beach house
Well, it
area.
looks like west of 61st is what you've
Yeah.
identified.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And just on a sub-note, does it take into account that out there, there's actually less transportation than there is closer in?
It does imperfectly. You recall, in order to find a measure I could use equally across the island and onto the mainland, I used the percentage of workers with short commutes. But in the process of doing this, I did look at the public transit access, and your problems here are the same we find in just about every city I look at. You have a good public transit system serving a small part of the island. Public transit off the island is almost non-existent, as near as I can tell. And certainly we find a tiny fraction of the workforce going to work other than by private automobile. You can imagine, for the clientele we're talking about, ownership of an automobile is quite a challenge on an extremely low income. So these are difficult.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Banks?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. McClure. I can't go against what but I am want to put up a couple of your,
Yes, ma'am. Which?
the colored ones with the of the island. First, I want to say something. Atlanta, number one, is a community with minorities, as you just said, high count of minority that are high economically, medium economically, and low economically. So it's going to be an African-American minority city, and they are going to be successful with what they're doing. You also talked about the fact that the mixed income houses should only have 20%, and our GHA has made an agreement of 50%, is that what you said?
51%.
51%. Well, one good thing about the reason that's successful over in Atlanta, Georgia Tech, is because it's near students, right? So we're looking at our Magnolia near UTMB to help that success as well. So we look at it a little differently than the fact that there's no one that would be interested in purchasing. Plus, our GHA agreement, deed agreement, and these council members know that right now, whether it's 1 year into it or 5 years, that they will possibly, if they stay empty forever, but they will not be given to public housing or Section 8. We also know that in the city of Galveston, the reason we have a high concentration of project-based voucher is because folk looked at the fact that they could get government money and came to this city to buy properties to make sure that they were high concentrated, and they're not doing anything about the business of keeping it. And I don't know if that's the problem of those persons who live in Chicago who own that property, or the city of Galveston, why we have not made sure that our code enforcements have taken care of getting them in check. Okay, so that takes care, and you're absolutely right about project-based vouchers. The city, GHA, has nothing to do with that, nor the city.
Well, it must be a contractor at some
It is
level,
a
but very
contractor.
often it's
And we
little more
had
than a
many
conduit
people who
through.
were going to revive a multitude of apartments so that they could get some of the money to make them project-based. So I just want our community to know that we're talking about two different places, project-based vouchers and Galveston Housing Authority. The other is, I'm sure that the folk are looking at this and very sad that the green part would be the part where probably the housing would be built because it's non-concentrated. You're going to make those people want to run out of Galveston. The other is, one of the things, I don't know, did you ever look into the fact that you might know who McCormick, Barron, and Salazar are because you are familiar with all of this process.
McCormick, Barron, Salazar.
And the same way in, gosh, I can't think of the thing right now. But anyway, they do have a human capital program. And our GHA is putting together a human capital program to help support those persons. And many of our communities, persons, are working with human capital program to support many of our folk out of poverty to help. Our school district is doing quite well in doing that too. So I just don't want the public to be just totally alarmed. Look at the space of Galveston. Look at the census tract versus the mainland. Galveston is a small, as you just said, 47,000 people. And you didn't tell us our population. How many African American, how many minorities, how many non-minorities? Do you have that?
I have that.
Could you give that to us too? Because we know that our school district is heavily minority.
Yeah, Galveston is about 51,000 population 2010, and the percent minority was 53% in 2010.
In 2010. And, well, that's pretty good. We're coming back up again because it put most of us off the island.
Yep.
But anyway, I just thank you, but I don't want the citizens to run. I want to thank GHA and the government for putting together. We are, just like you said, not about public housing. We're about mixed income. Those are the two Cedar Terrace and Palm Terrace, and maybe now the public will know that they are not public housing. They're mixed income housing, and that the mixed income deals with so many percentage public housing, Section 8, and market rate, meaning persons will buy. Hopefully, those of you who are looking for places to buy on the island, they will have some beautiful new apartments there. Let's see.
Thank you,
I
Ms.
think
Banks.
I got everything. Oh, wait a minute. I got to tell you
yes,
this
ma'am.
too. One thing that we have learned is that we, the island, did not take advantage while we had GHA with Section 3. And I know you're familiar with Section 3. We could have been making sure that people who needed jobs were trained. And we, the city, as well as our housing authority, have not done what we should have been doing to make sure that our population learned or were trained so that they could work in some. And so when the shipping area went, we just kind of like left people out there to fend for themselves. But we're on the road of doing that. So I just want to let you know some good things that are happening here based upon your...
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Robb?
Thank you for your presentation. And I just want to make a request that, can we get color copies of these maps? Or can you just
certainly.
send us the presentation? Because
On the way down, I noticed more than a few typos, so we'll get you a cleaned up copy and
Okay.
get it for you.
Alrighty.
Some of the sentences there aren't bringing pride to my high school English teacher, too. So I'll learn a few of those.
Thank you.
Dr. McClure, thank you very much for coming to Galveston.
Thank you. It's been a great
Greatly
pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you.